The Edmonton Oilers have 8 more years of Leon Draisaitl. Let's break it all down.
You are Locked On Oilers, your daily podcast on the Edmonton Oilers, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's edition of Locked On Oilers. I am your host, Nick Zararis. I want to thank everybody who makes Locked On Oilers their first listen of the day. Locked On Oilers, a part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Today's episode is brought to you by our friends over at Gametime. Download the Gametime app, create an account, and use code Locked On NHL for $20 off your first purchase. Terms apply. Download Gametime today. What time is it? Game time. So, today's show, we are going to talk all about this Leon Draisaitl contract extension that kicks in after this upcoming 2024-2025 season and will carry Draisaitl 8 years beyond that point at $14 million per season. At the outset, our first segment, we're going to talk about it in the moment, what it means, why it matters, we're going to do the old school inverted pyramid, the most important stuff first, then we're going to talk about Draisaitl, the player, the impact, what he represents, and then the final segment, we're going to talk about how the Oilers can try and keep this window of contention together as long as possible around Draisaitl, McDavid, and Evan Bouchard. So, at the outset, yesterday morning, I was in Central Park. If you saw the YouTube short, I was in the city yesterday. On Tuesday. I was in the city on Tuesday to go see Pearl Jam, and I got the notification, and I had to think for a minute. 14 million. And I was like, isn't that the most expensive? And very quickly saw a few tweets that were, yes, this is the most expensive contract in hockey. Going into this window, I assumed Draisaitl would leave a little meat on the bone. I assumed he would take a number between 12 and $13 million to leave a little meat on the bone so the Oilers could take care of other business. But I think, as I said in the short, Draisaitl's been one of the most underpaid players in the NHL over the duration of this previous contract he was on. If you recall, we did an entire episode in early July breaking down his contract path, that first ELC, and then the Oilers, and one of the few good moves Peter Chiarelli made as general manager, put chips in. The premise, the proposition of Draisaitl becoming a superstar, it was feasible. I don't think anybody in their wildest dreams even conceived Draisaitl would be this good. And Peter Chiarelli deserves credit for putting some equity on the table, putting some money up front and saying, this guy's been good. We think he's going to be an incredible talent. And this is a gamble, this contract, giving someone $8.5 million per year coming off of an entry-level contract with only, 2+ seasons of NHL experience. I think that is the type of calculated risk you need to make if you want to build a sustainable contender, because you need one of your star players on an undervalued contract. So first, I understand why this number is 14 million, why it's a little bit higher than I previously had forecasted, why it might be higher than what you previously expected, but we have to unpack it on a few levels. Number one, the cap is going to continue to go up. I understand we have been operating in a stagnant NHL contract economy for quite a few years now, where the cap's only gone up $1 million, if at all, the last handful of seasons. We all know the NHL's economic woes in comparison to, say, the NFL or the NBA, where those leagues make significantly more money, especially on their TV deals, and it allows for higher player salaries because there's a higher salary cap. In the hockey space, we've been operating in that low 80s to high 70s range for 6 years now. You go back and look at the history of salary caps in the NHL, we have not seen significant growth in a while. And even if the salary cap goes up 5, even if it all ambitious forecast, it 10% higher in a given year, we're going from 83.5 to 88.5. And then roughly you're going to assume that 2 years from now, you're looking at maybe 92, 93 million per season. And if you get that 5% rate of growth, the Oilers will be able to make some of this work without extraneous moves. But I do think, and I'm not going to get ahead of myself, this is something I want to talk about in the third segment, but the Oilers' calculus for building their roster does become a bit more fragile. They have less margin for error. And the first big point I want to make in this opening segment is one that is divergent. The 2 points, they conflict with each other. So bear with me. So number one, anytime you have a player as good as Leon Draisaitl, you have to keep them. It's that simple. It's the same reason the Leafs cannot get rid of Mitch Marner. It's the same reason that any of those players in that top 20 to 30 tier of players in the entire world, you are never going to get fair value in a trade in return for one of those guys. You're not. You could get 4, 5, 6, 7 prospects, draft picks. You could get the entire smorgasbord of assets in return for Draisaitl. It will not equal his impact. He is one of the premier players in this entire league. I have said that going into the offseason, off of the Cup final, he was somewhere in that 5 to 8 mark. I think I ultimately settled on him at 7 in the entire league, regardless of position, when I did my top 100 player rankings, which I do need to publish, by the way. But this is one of the best players in the world. Probably the best combined, if you added up everybody's traits of playmaker and goal scorer, if you put Draisaitl's together, he's probably the best of both when you add the traits together. But the counterpoint to this, and something that is tricky, just because a player is elite, and don't get me wrong, I think Draisaitl is one of the 10 best players in the world, arguably one of the 5 best players in the world. One of the conundrums the Oilers are going to face now is the same exact one that the Toronto Maple Leafs are facing right now. The New York Rangers are going to be facing next summer once Igor Shesterkin's contract gets ironed out. Great players are worth the money, but because they are so expensive, because there's so few of them, you have to pay whatever the market rate is, whatever the going rate is. It does make it harder to build out the rest of your roster. You do need veterans who are going to take that veteran minimum. You think about the Leafs take with Jason Spezza and Mark Giordano. You know, the Oilers, they had Corey Perry, Connor Brown. They got Henrique to take less money than he could have gotten on the open market. But the further the Oilers go down this path of continuing to leverage in the short term and continuing to pay for the best players in the world. And again, let me reiterate, you pay the best players in the world and then you try and figure it out. This is a gamble. All roster constructions are a gamble. And the premise of this team is, as long as we have Draisaitl and McDavid, we're a Stanley Cup contender. The dangerous part of that is, even though as good as those 2 guys are, 2 guys do not win you a Stanley Cup. You do need an entire team. And I don't want to make this comparison lightly because of how rough things got towards the end there, but do not be surprised if 3 years from now we're talking about Stan Bowman's management of an Oilers team around Draisaitl and McDavid, the same way we were talking about Bowman's management of a team around Patrick Kane and Jonathan Toews towards the end. You know, continuing to burn assets, continuing to spend money on trying to maintain a Stanley Cup contender, even though those 2 guys continued to get older, diminish, weren't as talented, and ultimately torpedoed that Blackhawks organization's long-term trajectory to the point that they've had to tank 3 straight seasons and they're still not particularly close to being a playoff team. So I do want to point that out, that is the bad outcome of this, that in the short term, yes, the Oilers are going to be right there. They're going to be one of the best teams. They are the betting favorite on FanDuel going into this upcoming NHL season. But just because you have the best players, just because you have the best roster, does not necessarily correlate success. And the more money you have tied up in fewer players, the smaller your margin for error and the more you need from your support staff. So we're going to take a quick break. We're going to talk about Draisaitl, the player, his toolbox, his value, what makes him so dangerous, coming up next on this edition of Locked On Oilers. If you're like me, you're trying to stave off the impending fall. You're trying to soak up the last bit of summer, the last bit of good weather. Went to the Met game last night, went to Pearl Jam on Tuesday. We are trying our best to get in every last bit of summer before it shifts to fall. And if you want to get out to a show, if you want to get to a game before summer's over, you got to check in with our friends over at Gametime, featuring some of the best tools in the ticket buying experience. Things like all-in pricing, where you toggle the feature on up front and there are no surprise fees at checkout. Seat views, where if you're at a baseball game or you're going to a concert, you want to get a good view. If you're going to a baseball game, you want to be able to tell balls and strikes. You want to be able to see if your view is blocked, if the ball's hit into certain parts of the outfield. Panoramic view, get a digital rendering of what your view from your seat will look like. The lowest price guarantee, or Gametime will credit you 110% of the difference. And Gametime ticket coverage, where your purchase is covered with the most flexible customer service policy in the ticketing industry. So take the guesswork out of buying tickets with Gametime. Download the Gametime app, create an account, and use code LOCKEDONNHL for $20 off your first purchase. Terms apply. Again, create an account and redeem code LOCKEDONNHL for $20 off. Download Gametime today. What time is it? Game time. Thank you for making Locked On Oilers your first listen of the day. For your second listen, enjoy the Locked On NHL podcast. Locked On NHL provides you with the national perspective on all things NHL each and every day, with national experts and local insights on every team in the league. Available on YouTube or wherever you get your podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. So we all know Draisaitl is incredible. We all know how his game has kind of evolved, how the Oilers have gone through a few different permutations of their team during the course of Draisaitl and McDavid's overlapping tenures. Number one, and most essentially, we know the Oilers' power play is ran through McDavid. They have that swinging moving point of, and it's what makes the Oilers' power play the best in the league, is they don't run the traditional point shot oriented power play where it goes through a defenseman who's orchestrating at the blue line. Instead, that inflection point is constantly moving, which puts significantly more stress on the other team's penalty kill. And because that point of interest where the puck's going through is consistently moving, it's around the perimeter of the zone, or it's getting in down low, or it's behind the net, it forces defenses to not have their eyes forward. You know, most of the time in a traditional penalty kill, they're looking all in the same direction. Those 4 points, they're collapsing closer and closer, and they're trying to force that puck to the outside. Your two forwards are pushing sticks out, trying to get the puck to the outside, because those are the lowest quality scoring chances. When that movement point, when that focus point is not at the point, and it is behind the net, and it's at the half wall, and it's all in one continuous motion, mind you. It's not them whipping the puck around where the penalty killers are able to shuffle side to side and kind of still maintain that perimeter around the goalie. And instead, because they're able to do it through McDavid, it opens up everything. Because McDavid is able to get to the goal line with just his skating, he doesn't need to pass it there. He's always got Hyman on the back door. And then if they're on the other half of the ice, he's got the one-timer for Draisaitl, who has gotten the near side almost on the goal line shot below the circle down to a science. It is a really difficult shot, but it's one that's extremely dangerous, A, because Draisaitl's a well above average career shooter, and number two, because McDavid is such a threat that he's got two high danger scoring chance opportunities just baked into every power play, because you got Hyman on the net and you got Draisaitl on the post. You still got the point shot where Bouchard is lingering. And then you still have McDavid himself being liable to take the puck on net, shoot it himself. Because you have all of that overlapping, you have three players in a really condensed space, really close to the net. And because of that, it puts extreme stress on the other team's penalty kill. And because of that, the Oilers are able to convert at an extremely high rate on the penalty kill. And because of that, the Oilers have, it's not a get out of jail free card, but it is a means of equalizer. It is a means of, even if they're not going at 5-on-5, even if they're struggling, it is a quick change in momentum. And special teams in hockey in particular have that juice factor. And we saw it a lot in the postseason in regards to the Oilers penalty kill, which was one of the best playoff performances by a team's penalty killing unit ever. Not just the recent, just one of the best penalty killing runs ever. It's different when you get that goal, though. And when you get Draisaitl going, you get McDavid going, you get Hyman going, because hockey is such a feel game. It's such a vibes-based game. Because of that, when you get Draisaitl humming on that short side shot, it gives the other team pause. And aside from his value on the power play, we got to talk about Draisaitl as one of the premier playoff performers of this era. When you go and look at the counting stats throughout the last handful of seasons when the Oilers have emerged as a bona fide Stanley Cup contender, Draisaitl's got 108 points in 74 career playoff games. And over the last 3 years, he's cooking. He's got 81 points in 53 games over the last 3 seasons. Yes, the longer you go in the playoffs, the more minutes you play, the better chance you are to have more points. But for Draisaitl to have 30 goals and 51 assists on 18.5% shooting on 162 shots, 30 goals on 162 shots, at really high rate. The one real complaint you can have about Draisaitl as a player is his defense, and that's fine. Draisaitl's defense isn't great. We can all admit that. It leaves a lot to be desired. He's often put out there with the expectation that he's going to make something happen offensively. And because of that, you're willing to look the other way. You're willing to accept the defensive woes. And because of that, it does create a bit of a drop-off. And I don't think Draisaitl is quite at the Matthews and McKinnon level. I think he's the next center down after those guys. Obviously, McDavid is the first center. He's the best player in the world. But you have two of the 4 or 5 best centers in the entire world on the same team. In a pinch, you can play them together at 5-on-5 and you figure out the rest. There are drawbacks to that. You saw it in Game 7 of the Stanley Cup Final. I can close my eyes sitting here in the middle of September, or I shouldn't say middle, in early September, and think about how just absolutely shot McDavid and Draisaitl's legs were in that game. Down the back half of Game 7, the third period, they just had no legs. I want to say they played close to 4 of the last final 10 minutes of the game after already playing a ton of minutes through the first 50. And because of that, they wore down. And I know there's been conjecture so far in the early stages of the offseason about maybe the Oilers look to dial back the McDavid and Draisaitl 5-on-5 minutes in the regular season with the mindset of we can uptick the workload the longer we go in the playoffs, the longer we go in the regular season. And because we're going to have such forward depth, and we haven't had forward depth like this in a long time, that we have a Jeff Skinner, we have a Victor Arvidsson, we have an Adam Henrique, we might have Matthew Savoie in the fold. When you have more options, you can diversify your offense. This was the first season in quite a while where Draisaitl and McDavid weren't each other's most common line mates. The Oilers were able to deploy 2 elite 5-on-5 lines offensively, at least. Defensively, we've said the Draisaitl line was not great. The Draisaitl line, in particular, in the Vancouver series, had a hard time at 5-on-5. They were in their own zone a lot. They were not doing as well at breaking out. It started to get a little bit better when they were able to add Dylan Holloway to that line as opposed to Evander Kane. Of course, Evander Kane was playing injured. You're willing to give him a little bit of a pass for his performance in the postseason, being that he wasn't healthy. But the last big point on Draisaitl and why it matters. Hockey is not quite the NBA where 2 superstars can get you to the conference finals easily, but we have seen the Oilers refine out what the rest of their team needs to look like now. They have got a really nice mix of forwards. You could use a little bit more dump and chase, grind it out style of hockey in their bottom 6, but it's probably the best 1 through 7, 1 through 8 forward group in the entire NHL. They've got the best or second best defensive pair in the entire league. And they have a goalie who has shown the ability to be a top 10-ish goalie in the world. And that's enough to get you in the door. The Oilers will be a playoff team for the majority, if not the entirety, of this Draisaitl extension because of him, because of McDavid, because of Evan Bouchard. Whether or not they ultimately break through, that is what we're going to talk about coming up next, so be sure to stick around. Putting it all together is the hardest thing to do in sports. You can be consistently a playoff team for a decade, 15 years even, and there is no guarantee that even if you do everything you can, you build the best possible roster, it's all going to work out for you. You can look at the San Jose Sharks. You can look at the New York Rangers over here in the hockey sphere. You can look over in the NFL. You can look at the Ravens with Lamar. You look at the Bills with Josh Allen. We're going on 6-7 years of those guys in the league, and they've had moments. They've gotten to AFC title games. They have come up short, and it is not always through fault of their own. In team sports, it takes a lot to go right. All it takes is one Mike Rupp goal on the fourth line for the Devils in 2003, and the Devils win the Stanley Cup. Whether or not they were the better team, they got the timely goal. You think about the Devontae Smith-Pelly goal for Washington when they beat Vegas to win the Stanley Cup. You think about the Nick Bonino goal. I think that was the San Jose year. It might have been the Nashville year for the Penguins. It takes everyone. And the Oilers, they were close. They were getting Connor Brown goals. They were getting Matthias Janmark goals. And when you're trying to win the Stanley Cup, it truly does take everyone. And that's the cautionary tale. That is the cautionary outlook of building a roster this way. I said it at the outset. Draisaitl, McDavid, you got to keep them. There is no value you're going to be able to get for those 2 players in trades. Even if someone gives you their entire team, if you got the entirety of another team for one of those guys, it will not be the same value because the one high impact guy is just able to do so much more. And it's a real double-edged sword, and it is a stinging indictment of the NHL's economic landscape that teams are getting punished for having good players. And I understand that's the entire point of having a salary cap, is that so good teams can't hoard all the best players, like pre-salary cap NHL, like Major League Baseball, where, the Dodgers, they have Freddie Freeman, Mookie Betts, Shohei Ohtani, Will Smith. Those are 4 of the 25 best players in the world. You throw Will Smith out, Ohtani, Freeman, and Mookie, those are 3 of the 5, 6 best players in the entire world. So I understand why small market teams insist on having a hard salary cap, because they don't want where the Rangers or the Red Wings or the Leafs or the Oilers have $140 million worth of roster players. And because of that, teams like the Oilers, teams like the Leafs, teams that find that transcendent, that superstar, that all-world talent, they feel these economic squeezes a lot more than teams at the bottom or in the middle of the pack. Because there are so few superstar players at this caliber, you have to pay them at top of the market. And I had said this a few weeks ago, but it was Draisaitl's responsibility for himself and for other players to get as much money as he possibly could. So that when the next guy comes up, and that'll be McDavid next summer, that guy has a higher starting asking price. And then whenever Draisaitl's all said and done, he's got all the money he needs. And ultimately, you have to accept that these superstars are going to get paid. They are going to be the most expensive players. And because of that, it's going to force an honest accounting. And you look at the money right now. Next summer, Draisaitl is going to go from 8.5 to 14. Bouchard's going to go from 3.6 to whatever his bridge number is. It'll at least be $6 million. That's for next summer. After that season, McDavid's going to go from 12.5 to at least 15, if not 16. Those increases, you get Draisaitl from 8.5 to 14. That's 5.5. You do Bouchard's 3.5, 3.6 up to 6. You do McDavid 12.5 up to 15. It's almost another $10, $12 million of cap to account for just to keep those 3 guys. You are realistically, if the Oilers are able to iron it all out, you're looking at least $29, $30 million in just McDavid and Draisaitl. You are talking about a third of your salary cap, more likely than not, depending on whether we go to 94 or we go to 98. However much you think the cap's going to go up, even if it goes up over 100 million 2 summers from now, you're talking about 30 of that 100 million in 2 guys. Then you got to do Bouchard. You got to do Stuart Skinner at some point. You're probably going to need a Zach Hyman, Ryan Nugent-Hopkins replacement 2 or 3 years from now, because those guys are going to be too old to be consistently able to depend on them. And really quickly, you start to realize how fragile all of this is. And the Oilers are positioned for right now. This is their we are leaving here with something team. They have invested a ton of money in their forward group. They feel like they've identified defensemen in Stetcher and Ty Emberson who are going to be able to be reasonable placeholders, or in the case of Emberson, someone with upside that we think we can develop and manufacture into a good hockey player. And those gambles are gambles. I think people need to accept that when you are building a team at the top of the market, when you don't have cap space, you are going to have to bake some gambles into your roster. There are different ways of going about it. You can look at it from a Oilers perspective, where Arvidsson and Skinner, proven track record players, but coming off of expensive or injury-laden contracts with other teams who need a chance to recoup their value. Or you go and look at what Vegas did with like Victor Olofsson and Alexander Holtz, where they put some money in on unproven guys who needed more playing time, with the idea that if we put them next to a really good player, they're going to be able to make something happen because of that. But it is a gamble, and the best team does not always win the Stanley Cup. I think every now and then you do get that. This past season, I do think Florida was the best team. Last year, honestly, I really do think Vegas was the best team. The year before that, Colorado really was the best team. But you get teams that get there over and over and over again, and they find a way to persevere. You think about how many times it takes before most of these teams break through, where it's 5, 6, 7 playoff appearances in a short window. And then the last time they're able to put it all together, that's when they break through. It happens. We're coming off of it where Florida lost the Stanley Cup final 2 years ago, And then this past year, they were able to break through, and that kind of bucked some convention because it had been a while since a team went from losing the cup final to winning the cup final in the following season. It is really, it is impossible to predict what is going to happen. You can put together as much information as you can, and believe me, I'm going to try to develop, to understand, to kind of game it out, if you will, to use a little game theory. And if this happens, then that happens. Can we manage if that happens? And the Oilers are putting a lot on just a few players. They are going to be in a position where it is going to come down to whether or not a McDavid or Draisaitl can buck off aging trends. Neither guy is particularly old now. 3-4 years from now, going into their early 30s at 14 and 15 million, probably a season, can you build a team around two guys making $30 million? We're going to find out very quickly. And Draisaitl's worth it. I want you to leave today's episode feeling accomplished that the Oilers have managed to keep one of the best players in the entire world. I want you to feel accomplished that the Oilers are going to have a really good chance to win the Stanley Cup this year. But do understand the burden that comes with expectation. You are going to be a little bit more disappointed if the team doesn't perform up to snuff, or if there is a losing streak or a lull out of the gate early on. And because of that, it's going to raise expectations. It is going to raise temperatures. I understand making fun of the Leafs is fun. Everyone likes to do it, but Mitch Marner is one of the 15, maybe even 10 best players in the entire world. And because of how high the expectations are in Toronto, because of the way they have their salary structured with the stars on that team, with him, with Matthews, with Nylander, with Tavares, it makes somebody have to be the scapegoat, because we're not all going to point fingers at David Camp for, oh, you guys didn't score. They're going to point fingers at Marner. They're going to point fingers at Nylander, at Marner, at Matthews, at Tavares. And because of that, it makes things a lot more contentious. But that will just about do it for today's edition of Locked On Oilers. If you could be so kind, go check out the Locked On NHL podcast, where the season never ends and provides national expertise with a local perspective. You can find the link to Locked On NHL in the description, so you don't need to search. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. I will talk to you guys tomorrow. Until then, let's go Oilers.